Hello, everyone. This is a new episode of the Freedom of Religion or Belief of FoRB podcast that we are making as a part of Talk About Law and Religion blog. I'm Dmytro Vovk, and my co-host here is Merilin Kiviorg. Hello, Merilin.
Hello, Dmytro.
The topic we are going to discuss today was inspired by two specific documents. We as lawyers belong to the community that worship and celebrate official documents more than anything else. The first document is the recent Ukrainian law banning the operation of the Russian Orthodox Church and all Ukrainian organizations affiliated with the Russian Church. The law that, according to President Zelensky, liberates Ukraine from, I quote, Moscow devils, specifically bans the so-called Russian world ideology. Religious organizations involved in the dissemination of this ideology can be prohibited. And the second document is a declaration produced by the World Russian People's Council. This is a sort of NGO established by the Russian Orthodox Church. And the declaration was adopted in March 2024. And this is a very aggressive chauvinist text claiming that the Russian aggression against Ukraine is a defensive war of the Russian people against the West, which is now under the power of the devil. That Russia has specific rights to impose control over Ukraine, and that the territory of Ukraine is a part of this Russian world. And the Russian world itself has no borders, as it unites all Russians by ethnicity, language, culture, and even all people who share the values of the Russian civilization. And therefore, Russia has some sort of specific right to protect this unknown group of people virtually everywhere. So our goal today is to discuss this Russian world phenomenon, its role in the Russian aggression against Ukraine and in different forms other countries. And we also want to talk about national and international responses to the Russian world, such as the Ukrainian law I mentioned. For this purpose, we invite two brilliant specialists. We have here Catherine Wanner, professor of Pennsylvania State University. Catherine is a world-leading specialist in religion and religiosity in post-Soviet space with a specific focus on Ukraine. She wrote several highly acclaimed books on the topic, exploring the role of religion in the Ukrainian society. Our second guest is Thomas Bremer. Thomas is a professor emeritus of University of Münster in Germany, with a career-long interest in Christian Orthodoxy, the Russian Orthodox Church, and its relations with the Russian state. Thomas recently published a paper in the Russian world as a theological and ideological concept. We are grateful to both of you for coming. And my first question, probably to Thomas, what is this Russian world thing? How would you define it?
Thank you for having me. And I'm sorry a little bit about my voice. I've got a cold, but I hope I can make myself understandable. So how to define Russian worlds? It's a very difficult question because everyone who researched that topic, that idea, agrees basically that it's a very unclear and a very blurry concept. So you'll find all kinds of definition used in the documents which you mentioned, but also earlier in documents and statements of the Russian Church or of individuals from the Russian Orthodox Church, which are partly even contradictory. But I think what is important for us now is that nowadays, since the full-scale aggression of Russia against Ukraine, Russian world is used by Russian authorities and also by the Russian Orthodox Church, again, more and more, as a concept which is anti-Western. You mentioned the document from the Russian World Council, and that is very, very clear that they say it's, they speak about the fight of Russia against the satanic West and so on. So it's the idea that there is a special set of values and of behavior and of issues which are contrary to what in the liberal Western world is usually presented. And so the term we cannot, or I cannot, and I think one cannot shortly and concretely define what Russian world means, but for our purposes, I think it's enough to understand how it is used. It is used as something which has a very clear anti-Western attitude.
Catherine, would you like to jump in?
Sure, I'd be pleased to. And once again, thank you for the invitation and for that very generous introduction. I agree that the Russian world is really a concept. And in and of itself, it's quite a simple, straightforward concept, one that namely posits that a certain historical space has bequeathed a common history, and that history manifests itself in a shared political space, and that those are constants. That is to say, that a religious domain should match a political domain. And therein lies the difficulty, in that the Russian world as a concept has been used as part of a political strategy. It lends itself to instrumentalization. But I think it's also important to note that the Russian world concept has evolved over time. Initially, it was language was the cornerstone of the Russian world, and it was originally oriented towards the diaspora. If you remember, in the decades prior to the collapse of the USSR and in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the USSR, there was massive outmigration and population transfers in all different directions. And the idea of initially the use of the Russian world was to use Russian speakers, if you will, as a way of, as one says, right-sizing the Russian Federation. That is to say, use Russian speakers wherever they may be, in North America, in Western Europe, or in other parts of the former Soviet Union, as a means by which the Russian Federation could continue to maintain its status as something of a superpower and its influence in those different countries. Over time, of course, although perhaps that concept of using language was in part inspired by, I think, Josip Brodsky's very famous statement, "Moya rodina ruski yazyk," my homeland is the Russian language. And I think that was the initial impetus for grounding the Russian world in language.
Brodsky was expelled from Russia in 1972. The day when he left the Soviet Union, he wrote a letter to the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. In the letter, Brodsky said, I quote, "A language is a much more ancient and inevitable thing than a state. I belong to the Russian language." He meant that he was losing his Soviet citizenship, but not his homeland, as he could preserve his Russian language to which he belongs. Much later, this will resonate with a more dangerous idea that the Russian world is everywhere where people speak Russian.
Over time, I think language proved to be not as effective a unifier as perhaps its original architects would have hoped. People either became or were from the beginning bilingual. Language was a means to assimilate into different countries, be they the successor states of the former Soviet Union or other countries in Western Europe or North America. And so over time, the Russian world increasingly became connected with the Russian Orthodox Church and with religion in particular. And it's important to note that the Russian world, I agree with much of what Thomas has said, the Russian world could ground itself in could use the Russian Orthodox Church and the certain values that it claimed to foster as then a means of retaining influence within a variety of regions around the world. The number of regions are growing. Those values that are associated with the Russian world, as Thomas mentioned, were originally sort of a conservative communitarianism. In other words, it was a celebration of so-called traditional values. And by that, they meant that certain aspects of identity were organic and as a result, eternal and unchanging. First and foremost, they posited everything associated with gender roles and identities, sexual roles and identities, but that extended even to include national identities. In other words, the idea was that there are certain God-given attributes that are not meant to change. In fact, they cannot be changed. And this is what is then encapsulated in this idea of traditional values. And that has what has become the cornerstone, if you will, of the Russian world. And I think, to my mind, most especially since 2009, Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church has propagated such views. That conception of the Russian world has been integrated into, if you will, almost a messianic political vision of Vladimir Putin, who aims to reclaim the respect and power that the Soviet Union once had for the Russian Federation. And among the means that he uses to do this, and certainly to justify and legitimize the actions that he has undertaken, is the Russian world. That is to say, he is the Russian Federation and by extension the Russian world is in a domain in which those kinds of God-given attributes of gender, sex, national identity, and the like are protected. And the kind of things that Ukrainians are proposing, such as making a different kind of civilizational choice to associate themselves with Europe, that is specifically what the Russian world seeks to block, because this is seen as a perversion of a kind of historical destiny that has been bequeathed to those who share a common religious and historical heritage that should be enshrined in a common spiritual and historical space. So it's important to note that although the Russian world is a concept, a fairly simplistic concept that equates a religious historical heritage with a current political regime, that has been melded and married to a political strategy. And as such, then religion, broadly writ, not just the Russian Orthodox Church, then becomes quite vulnerable to instrumentalization in pursuit of certain political aims. And this is why then the Russian world is sometimes referred to as a Russian world ideology, because it has become a cornerstone of a certain political vision. There are multiple ramifications of this evolution of the Russian world concept, which I think it's also important to speak about.
You both mentioned that the Russian world ideology, doctrine, or set of cliches, whatever, is being used by the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church. But in this tandem, who plays the main role and whose role is merely supporting? It's the state that utilizes the church and its doctrine to pursue some political ends, or is the church that somehow uses the state to reach certain ecclesiastical goals, like, for example, implementing some sort of theology in the real life?
I am not sure whether we can speak about a chronological order. That's a question which I get very frequently, is Putin influencing Kirill or Kirill Putin? Who calls whom and says what say? And I think, I mean, I don't know, of course, actually, or obviously, but I think there's no need to call each other because they agree in these points. No? I mean, I would say that's the bad news. I am quite sure that Putin is convinced of what he says and that he believes in all these things, which Casey just mentioned about his values and so on. And Putin, of course, and Kirill, of course, also does. So there is no one uses the other one, but we have a combination of two entities, like the Russian authorities, the Russian state, and the Russian Orthodox Church, who basically agree on these topics. And I would like to add, if I may, maybe two short points. One, I'm a little bit skeptic because both of you, Casey, and you, Dmytro, used the word concept or ideology or ideological concept. And I am, because of the nature of the unclear and blurry nature of Russian world, of this term, not sure. I'm quite sure one cannot call it an ideology, because an ideology has to have an idea and has to have a kind of concept, and you need a Das Kapital by Karl Marx or Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, something, a basic thing, and then you can make an ideology and you can put it into life. But from a set of ideas, for example, Casey mentioned language, but we have quotes from Kirill in the 2014 or so, where he says, well, the Russian Russky Mir is a Russian world is a multilingual space, and we should organize also in parishes abroad. We should organize classes in Ukrainian and in Moldovan language and so on. So it's obviously, even then, it was not so much about language. It's very unclear. So therefore, I'm skeptical about concept and ideology. And the other point is, Casey also spoke about, and I completely agree, about a common historical place. Of course, this is banal. No? There was these areas have largely a common history, and history always is an object of interpretation. No? Was it good for us or bad for us, and so on. And each person and in each epoch would interpret it in a different way. And the point, the problem is, that's how I also understood Casey, that the fact that something historically has been in a certain way has no impact for political action today. And that is what they do, Putin and Kirill and these people who think this way. No? There was once a common state of Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians. So that means we must have the state as one state, political entity again. And that is, of course, nonsense, because history consists of change, of things changing. By the way, also valid for the values. No? We have certain values which are important for us, but 100 years ago, and in 100 years, there probably will be different values. They are not God-given. They are not they are man-made and understood and interpreted. No? So I would not see an ideology behind the Russian world, but it's more a narrative, I would say, which covers the inadequate use of history which we can observe in Russian intellectual circles, in the government, and in the church.
I would just add that I didn't say I call it an ideology. I said people, it's very often referred to as an ideology, and because it is politically instrumentalized. I think it is a concept, and Thomas, I agree with him completely, that the components of this concept are entirely open to interpretation and are, as I tried to show, they have changed over time. But as a concept, I mean, it has no agency in and of itself. And this is why, for example, it has to be integrated into some interpretation of this concept, and the very slippery elements that go into it have to be then equated, if you will, with things like gender and sex. And that's one of the reasons why you have a constellation of values. That's one of the ways in which they try to communicate that a prior historical, as Thomas mentioned, political entity that united Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus is eternal, much as being born female or a woman is eternal too. Ends up being a legitimation for a particular interpretation of a historical experience and a particular interpretation of the heritage that this has bequeathed. And then as a result, the political entity that should emerge from today as an organic, eternal, and righteous entity. I think among the difficulties that we have here is, once again, I agree with Thomas, for many parties, this becomes useful. This is an expedient means to achieve certain political goals. And so you have multiple parties utilizing, if you will, the Russian world for diverse purposes. And that's why it's not that the concept of the Russian world or a political entity uses it. It's used by multiple parties in pursuit of their own self-interests. But because it is so amorphous and open to interpretation, it lends itself very well to political justification for the realization of certain visions or the achievement of certain political goals.
And I would add, if I may, I completely agree. We agree on everything, obviously. It is used by all kinds of parties. It's also used by the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainian government and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine use, I have made a word count, so it's very clear, in the last year since the full-scale invasion, the term Russian world or Russian world ideology as an explanation for everything Russia does towards Ukraine, which I think it's also not very helpful because, I mean, it's a narrative. In war times, you need a narrative, so it's understandable. But for a scholarly analysis, you need better and deeper things than just saying it's a Russian world ideology and said it is. So it's used. The problem is that it is used, and it's used by all kinds of parties and sides, as you said.
And one of the things that really gives the Russian world its political power is that it becomes married to the concept of victimhood. And multiple parties use the idea that we have been victimized. They used it in different ways, but by positing that we have been victimized, and the Russian world on some level either plays a role in an element that must be eliminated that is a victimizer itself, or the Russian world is a means of staving off being victimized. So again, we see movement back and forth, but it's very, very important that the Russian world gets connected with victimhood. And this is what we see happening. For example, on the Ukrainian side, it's true. One posits that Ukraine has been victimized by the implementation of this kind of vision of forcibly reuniting Ukraine in its righteous place together with Russia and Belarus under a single Orthodox Church and under a single political regime, both of which then are ruled from Moscow. It's used then on the Russian side by positing that Russia itself has been and continues to be victimized by the West, that seeks to diminish the power of Russia and the standing of Russia on the world geopolitical stage. And then the Russian world becomes a means of defending Russia against this kind of victimization. The key point is that once you have this kind of amorphous concept with elements that can be open to manipulation, that involve religion and the state, and when they get attached to a narrative of victimhood, the result of this, and whether one speaks about Ukraine or Russia or other countries in the world, is you have, which you, Dmytro, have pointed out, a growing desecularization that begins to take root. We see that this leads to desecularization via shifts on multiple levels. For one, we see then the state, a state entity, becoming ever more interested in the intricate, even workings of religious organizations. So you have then sort of growing state intervention in religious affairs, even though multiple countries, including the ones we're discussing, have constitutions that posit a separation of church and state. We also see the dynamic moving in the other direction, whereby certain religious organizations actively seek the curry and the favor and the protection of the state. And this, in the case of Ukraine, really represents a shift from the dynamics that we saw within the 20th century, whereby various religious organizations, I think to my mind, most notably the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, tended to situate themselves as critics, as opponents of state entities, whatever they may be. But now, what we see, especially under the conditions of war, are certain church religious organizations actively seeking the favor and the protection of the state. So from multiple directions, again, we have a melding of interests, and that's because justifications for certain policies increasingly draw on religious concepts and sentiments for their legitimation. And it correspondingly very often works to the benefit of certain state actors and certain religious actors.
Kathy pointed out growing state intervention in religious affairs, but also the usage or utilization of Russky mir by multiple actors. Estonia, like Ukraine, has a long border with the Russian Federation, although Estonia is in the EU and NATO. Activities by the Russian Federation and Russian Orthodox Church involving Russky mir, Russian world, are considered in Estonia as a serious threat to national security, especially after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Hence, there have been public and political calls to ban the Russian Orthodox Church in Estonia, similar to Ukraine. For example, in May, the Estonian parliament passed a statement condemning the actions of the Moscow Patriarchate in justifying and supporting Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and declared the Moscow Patriarchate an institution sponsoring Russia's military aggression. It specifically states that the leaders of the Moscow Patriarchate are using the Russian world ideology as a tool to promote the war and utilize it to destroy the last manifestations of Russian democracy, militarize Russian society, and justify the aggression in order to extend the Russian Federation to all the territories dominated by it in the past, such as also Estonia. After that, the Ministry of Interior issued a clarification stating that declaring the Moscow Patriarchate an institution supporting military aggression is not directed against the members of the Estonian Orthodox Church in Moscow Patriarchate. It will still remain possible to practice the Orthodox faith in Estonia in the future. Just to note, there are two Orthodox churches in Estonia, one under the Moscow Patriarchate and the other one under the Constantinople Patriarchate. However, there is a governmental pressure on the Estonian Orthodox Church in Moscow Patriarchate and its congregations to leave Moscow Patriarchy, that is, to change their canonical subordination. It is not clear yet what will happen if they do not comply, or what kind of legislative measures will be adopted. Recently, the mentioned church has taken the state to court. Results of this, of course, remain also to be seen. I wanted to ask you, Kathy, what is the situation or reaction in the US regarding the Russian Federation and the Russian Orthodox Church's utilization of Russky mir with its political and religious elements, especially after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Have there been any shifts, and how are different actors responding? Is there any debate?
I'm really taken aback at the extent to which I see growing very swiftly, the ramifications of these kinds of issues within Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, the extent to which those kinds of tensions, and specifically conflicts on a religious plane on the territory of Ukraine, having very strong reverberations in the United States. And let me give you several examples of that. I mentioned earlier that I really think that what we see is this kind of growing desecularization as you have religious elements, such as the Russian world, but not exclusively. We could point to Putin's messianism as well. We have these certain religious elements that are blending with political strategies for accomplishing certain goals. These those efforts, and especially when they're accompanied by these narratives of victimhood, as I mentioned earlier, become really important because in order for laws to be accepted and let alone effectively implemented, there needs to be a certain degree of popular accord that these laws are just and worthy of respect. And so I would say these kinds of narratives that we're pointing to have really tremendous import for legal and legislative development. What's happening in the United States is that in that kind of growing desecularization, whereby certain religious goals become political goals and political goals become one side of the same coin that also has religious goals, we see different religious organizations in Ukraine hiring, for example, lobbyists to encourage lawmakers in the US, and primarily Republican lawmakers who are among the most reticent to support Ukraine militarily and any other way. They are some of the least invested in Ukraine's victory. But within the Republican Party, they themselves have used the values of their base, evangelicals, to garner votes and legitimacy. And so we have a deft move here on the part of Ukrainian evangelicals, together with Americans who are interested in defeating Republican candidates in November, using the issue of religion in Ukraine to their benefit. There are multiple groups using that in multiple ways. They all hinge, though, on asserting that there is repression of Christians in Ukraine. Different groups see different groups being repressed, but they all use the violation of basic freedom of religion as a reason to argue in favor of continued support for Ukraine or against support for Ukraine. So you have multiple groups, all with lobbyists in the United States working members of Congress to vote a particular way on aid to Ukraine. Just to give two specific examples, one to follow up on what Dmytro already said, you have Ukrainian evangelicals who met with Speaker Mike Johnson, who is himself a devout evangelical Christian from a very religiously active region of the country, from Louisiana, and who have argued that in the occupied territories of Ukraine, there is tremendous religious repression, and that is oriented heavily towards Protestants. Heavily towards Protestants because they are religious minorities and because they are closely associated with the United States. And Mike Johnson came out and said that he was very touched by the testimonies of these various Ukrainian evangelicals and the evidence that they provided for the repression of Protestants in the occupied territories. In other words, under Russian rule. Republicans up until this point have, especially led by Mr. Trump, are, of course, there are many statements where one could conclude that Mr. Trump is enamored with Mr. Putin. And so this then becomes a way of undermining Russian claims to Ukrainian territories and undermining the willingness to allow Russia to claim Ukrainian territories if this means the loss of what had been established rights to freedom of religion and established religious pluralism in Ukraine, and specifically the repression of evangelicals. As we know, of course, also members of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, members even of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and a whole host of other religious groups also incur repression in the occupied territories. But nonetheless, that is one narrative that has been particularly effective with evangelicals. that then has spurned yet another effort that is financed by a certain oligarch who is a supporter of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And he has hired Robert Amsterdam, who's a Canadian who works primarily out of London, to lobby in the United States on behalf of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, claiming that this church, the largest in Ukraine, if one judges by the sheer number of parishes, which are increasingly difficult to know what exactly are the sheer numbers, but nonetheless, are arguing on that front that this church is now being repressed by the Ukrainian state. And so, in fact, yes, indeed, there is repression of Christians in Ukraine, but it is repressions of Orthodox Christians within the government-controlled territories of Ukraine. That's just two examples where we see the trends that I mentioned via the Russian world of the growing desecularization and the growing use of religious concepts combined with certain historical narratives and certain narratives of victimhood that find a place within a particular political strategy that curries religious nationalism based on these kinds of theopolitical values that are increasingly heard in Ukraine are, by extension, now increasingly heard in the United States as well, too. The idea being that certain Christians are persecuted in Ukraine mandates a political response by American lawmakers.
Thomas, can you reflect on reactions in Europe, or specifically on the situation in Germany, especially after the Russian aggression? First, are there any debates on the threat of the Russian world to Western civilization? And secondly, are reactions in Russia, neighboring states like Ukraine, to possible threats of this ideology discussed?
Well, in any case, we don't have in Germany, and I believe in most of Central and Western Europe, this kind of attempts of political influence, as Casey just described for the United States. When she was speaking, I was thinking, why do we not have it? And I had 2 points. One is we don't have evangelicals. We have small groups, and they're not political, not important. And the second is we don't have elections this year. We don't have federal elections. We have local, but no elections. So you couldn't use it for election purposes. I doubt that if we would have elections, that using religion would have an impact and would be a good strategy for any party to the right wing, the AfD, famous right wing party now, they use Islam, meaning anti-Islam fears, saying protection of the Western culture and so on. But in fact, it does not play a role. As the debate we have here is a political and nowadays it's hard to discern the two, but a political and a military one. So the question about military support for Ukraine or not. And it's very interesting. I cannot elaborate on that, but it's really interesting because you see a East-West divide in Germany. What used to be Eastern Germany, GDR, people they have a significantly different opinion about whether we should deliver weapons to Ukraine or not than in the rest of the country. And there is the right-wing party AfD, and the new created in January, only officially created party named after a former very left-wing member of the party Die Linke, which is the former Communist Party in GDR, Sarah Wagenknecht, and she, starting from zero, got 12%. And her points are also, we have to limit migration, and we have to stop delivering weapons to Ukraine. And the narrative is always, every war ended with negotiations, and we have to start a diplomatic process in negotiations. I do not remember the negotiations Churchill had with Hitler to stop the Second World War, but that's the idea. People do not think that or people know. Okay, so people think that with negotiations, or some people think that with negotiations you can do miracles. And that is, some people call it the horseshoe theory, because the two ends come together, like as in a horseshoe, the very right and the very left come together in these points. And the a little bit shocking results was, as you have probably heard in the elections 2 weeks ago, in Thuringia and in Saxony, you had almost in both states, almost 50% of the voters who were for one of these two groups, so for stopping the support for Ukraine. It's a very small share of the German population. Germany has 83 million inhabitants, and these are, I think Thuringia has 1.7 and the other 3 million or so. So it's a very small share, but nevertheless, but all this is not connected with religion and with this idea of Russian world, but it is strictly political and military. Religion, I would say, almost doesn't play a role there. It might become an issue, for example, because of the new law of the law which you quoted in the very beginning for the ban of the Russian Orthodox Church and affiliated religious organizations. It might be an issue in European Union accession talks, but that is it's not so concrete for the time being that it would be mentioned.
You mentioned that the Russian world includes these traditional values about gender and sexuality. And we see that before the full-scale invasion, both the Russian government and the Russian church had invested a lot to the promotion of traditional values, specifically in the West. And then the invasion happened, and you said that the Russian world is used for the justification of the war. Would you agree that this is the war over these values, or the war against what Russians think as Western values, liberalism and secularity? This is a simplification, but still.
When we speak about values which are connected with the Russian world, that's very interesting. I had a list, several lists of these values, and I will quote something from Patriarch Kirill, which he said in 2009. He listed the values of the Russian world, and it was devotion to God, love for the homeland, love for people, justice, international and interreligious peace, thirst for knowledge, love for work, respect towards the elderly. These are values every one of us would subscribe to. No? So I don't see what is specific for Russian world. These are human good. Most people in the world probably would accept these values. When it comes to the things which Casey mentioned earlier about gender, sex, homosexuality, and so on, then we have a very strict position of the Russian Orthodox Church, but it is basically the same position also of the churches in Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainian churches made very clear statements when the Ukrainian parliament discussed a law which was demanded by the European Union about same-sex marriages. They discussed very critically the Istanbul Convention, which is against domestic violence, and so on. So they fight a Russian world and Putin and Kirill, but in these points, in these value points, they basically agree with them. No? In difference, for example, to churches in my country, here in Germany, the Roman Catholic Church here and the Protestant Church, the two largest churches, have the Catholic Church, as you know, has a very cautious approach to these issues. But nowadays, no bishop here would ever say, a Catholic bishop would ever say, like homosexuality is bad or is a sin or is a disease or something like that. No, we have to be respectful and we have to accept everybody and it can and so on and so on. No? And so the churches here in Western Europe change or are changing or changed already their positions towards these issues. But basically in these issues, in these like let's call them ethical issues, the Ukrainian churches and the Council of Churches and Religious Communities in Ukraine, they agree basically. They don't say we agree with Russia, but they agree in these points with the values which are also represented by Russian world and by the Russian Orthodox Church. So it's an absurd situation, and it shows that the war, of course, is not about values and about family and homosexuality, but it's about its influence and territory and power and so Putin did not start the war preserve kids from homosexual propaganda, but he started it to gain territory, to gain political control over Ukraine.
And speaking about, though, the one difference, though, that I do think exists, Thomas, is that I wonder to what extent in Ukraine, I agree with you that there are a great many people that subscribe to those kinds of very conservative traditional values, especially concerning as they affect women and homosexuality. But I wonder to what extent in Ukraine they wouldn't be willing to overcome that in favor of joining the EU. In other words, if one there still is overwhelming support for becoming part of the EU, and if, let's say, the price of entry was to have legislation that would be more favorable to women and to sexual minorities and would prohibit domestic violence and the like, I wonder to what extent Ukrainians would be willing to accept that as an exchange. And then, that's speculation, of course, but I think there is a real possibility for that. It's unclear whether you have that same willingness to adapt one's values or to implement far more of a sliding scale when it comes to issues concerning gender and homosexuality. And I might add, those are also hot button issues in the United States as well, and ever more so. And so I think one could say that by that logic, it's not clear that simply by embracing fairly conservative views on reproductive rights or on the rights of homosexuals, that one then is inclined to buy into the Russian world or to Putin's messianic vision, because we see sort of overlaps of some kind of endorsement of that very conservative view of gender, reproductive rights, women's rights, domestic violence, right on down the line, to a degree in the United States as well, but yet a rejection of the political project there. And I wonder to what extent, arguably, we have a similar kind of picture that is attempting to emerge in Ukraine, but under conditions of war is less visible.
Well, I did not say that the churches in Ukraine subscribe to this ideology, as we do not subscribe to the ideology when we agree on the list of values I read to you earlier. That is very clear. I think it will mean in the end, of course, I also agree that majority of Ukrainians probably will we have same-sex marriages and enter the EU, or not have them but stay outside. They will be for the European Union, which means in the end that the churches will have to resignate and to say, okay, we are sorry, we don't like it, but that's what we accept. So the influence of religion will become less if it does not follow, if religion does not follow certain, I'm not saying they should follow trends or developments, but not understand where they are, in which historical point, in which society, then their influence will become minor. We are beyond the times when the church said, do it like this, and everyone did it.
That's right. They are obliged to adapt to the historical circumstances in which they live, and they must adapt in order to remain meaningful and relevant in whichever society one speaks about, both on a social, cultural, and certainly on a political level.
Well, I just wanted to add that from a legal point of view, there is, thinking about the Ukraine joining European Union, there is, legally speaking, no demand for accepting same-sex marriages as such. Even, European Court of Human Rights has not yet demanded this kind of interpretation of the matter, but some sort of recognition has to be provided for them, and that's maybe a point of discussion regarding Ukraine and EU as well. But legally speaking, the marriage is not yet sort of obligatory from the European point of view. Talking about the values, and I'm thinking about also Estonia, where I live and work, and We had a very long discussion and debate about also these gender issues and accepting same-sex marriages and cohabitation, and all the churches were actually pretty much opposed to it. Even Protestant churches, when Estonia also thinks that value-wise, in at least within that discussion, we try to see ourselves more Scandinavian. And when we look at the Scandinavian churches have moved on in that sense, the Protestant churches, and painfully or not, but many of them accepting the same-sex sexual the people's choices in sexual orientation. And in Estonia, we had quite a bit of struggle until we finally adopted a law which recognizes the equality of marriage.
This is what I wanted to say, because there is this third option here. It's not, joining EU and adopting same-sex marriages, or not joining and having only heterosexual marriage. The thing is that many Ukrainians would say that we would like to be as Poland, we would like to be as Hungary, we would like to be this part of Eastern Europe, part of the European Union. So preserving our some sort of moral values, but still be a part of the European Union. And this is a very, tricky thing, because I would say that the motivation of Ukrainian citizens of joining the European Union is mostly social economic. We would like to have life like that. We would like to have all those social and economic opportunities. What we definitely don't have here, and I think this is very important, we don't have state-supported homophobia. And as in many other places in post-Soviet world, this desecularization that Katie mentioned, it requires some sort of state support. It requires this anti-LGBTQ propaganda through government's channel, not just grassroots initiatives. And this is definitely not the case of Ukraine, because when Ukraine needs to adopt some sort of EU relevant legislation that is contrary to position of major religious groups, Ukraine usually does it very well. And we had it, for example, with the implementation of anti-discrimination norms to labor code. All churches were against, but President Poroshenko insisted that we must have it because it's a part of our European agenda. We had the same situation with Istanbul Convention. All churches were against because there was a gender identity and sexual orientation there, but President Zelensky said, no, we need it, and the convention was ratified. So this is a sort of tricky issue. But my question, and this is probably the last question, it might be a bit provocative, but still, if Putin dies, or if Patriarch Kirill dies, will the Russian world disappear? And if not, if it's something bigger and more serious, what we can do with all that stuff?
I think maybe it's not, the question is not if Putin or Patriarch Kirill die, but it's because if that would be the case, I'm relatively sure that very similar or even worse people would come after them. So it's not about individuals, it's about the system. Right? If Putinism stops, or if the system, this idea, this use of history, if that stops. So that is a different question. And for me, the problem is that I cannot see in my limited fantasy how that can happen. I mean, Putin can die and the Patriarch can die, but then other people will be president and Patriarch, and they will do similar things, maybe even worse, maybe better. I don't know. We don't know, but it will not change the whole thing. But a change of the I wouldn't say system, but of the attitude, a change of the attitude, and so that which would be of central importance for not only for Ukraine, of course, for Ukraine, but also for Europe and for the whole world in the end. It's the tragic, or the dilemma is it's necessary, and I have no idea how it could come.
I would add to what you just said, Dmytro, the idea that the difference might be in the case of Ukraine, what you had, the various examples that you just listed of religious organizations being against certain forms of legislation, certain laws, but nonetheless the state adopts them, or against signing certain treaties, but the state adopts them. The question will be to what extent that tendency can continue in Ukraine, given the conditions of war, and how difficult this war is proving as it is in its third year. And of course, the longer it goes on, the more difficult it gets. And I think we're all aware of the fact that even if there was a ceasefire tomorrow, that doesn't necessarily guarantee peace. So in other words, I think there are hard times ahead in Ukraine. It's going to be difficult to govern this country. And to what extent there will be a reliance, if you will, on religious organizations for the purposes of legitimizing and realizing certain political projects. And I think this perhaps is whereas Ukraine might be at a crossroads, I think there is going back to what Thomas said, a fairly clear record in Russia where you have had consistent cooperation in Russia between religious authorities and political authorities, sometimes more vigorously and enthusiastically offered than others, but nonetheless not the kind of consistent criticism that had been there in Ukraine. And the question is, I think, what going forward, what the relationship and what the ability to instrumentalize each other will be. And I think that will be perhaps a more determinative factor in terms of what the future of holds for Ukraine and what the future holds for Putin. I think a recourse to religion has been a fairly steady resource for ruling authorities in Russia for quite some time. That has been the case at certain periods in Ukraine, but not always, nowhere near as reliably so. And one can point to, as you mentioned, these recent examples and the various pressures that exist on Ukraine, given its current and ongoing need to protect itself from Russian aggression. That means it can be subject to forms of influence to encourage certain forms of non-discrimination, non-discriminatory legislation, and non-discriminatory laws. And so in that sense, there is a chance going forward then if if the Ukrainian state can maintain that degree of independence, and if religious authorities can have going forward a degree of independence to criticize state authorities, and by this I include the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, then perhaps we could have a more beneficial or positive outcome in Ukraine, to the extent that with or without Putin or with or without Kirill, whoever is in those offices, to the extent that they continue to have the mutual instrumentalization of the church using the state and the state using the church, we're going to likely have ongoing forms of religiously nationalist policies that are going to privilege certain religious organizations, which then encourage their reliance on the state, and the state making ever more risky moves where it needs the church to legitimate its actions, such as its invasion of Ukraine and any other kinds of antagonistic measures it might take that prompt its people to migrate or incur international isolation. Then the state is going to need the church. And so it's unclear that kind of ongoing, proven beneficial, if you will, on some level to some, that kind of mutual forms of aid, to the extent that that carries on in Russia. I agree with Thomas that on some level it doesn't really matter who's the patriarch or who's the president of Russia. I mean, Putin has his own messianic vision for Russia, but if someone should have some other kind of vision, and to the extent that it draws on these kinds of religious elements, I think there's going to be the ongoing synergy, and by extension, sort of religious nationalism and the kind of use of theopolitics to govern in Russia that we see today, even though the details might change.
I would like to add a short note to that, and that is also to what we said earlier. First, it's a fact that societies change. So when we discussed about the attitude toward homosexuality, of course, 30, 40, 50 years ago in Germany, it was even forbidden by law not so long time ago, and so on. Huh? And now it's a different. So, and that means that also other societies can and will change. And the other point is there is in Russian history, there's a book which is also available in English by Regina Elsner, my colleague, who wrote about the, so to say, the critical juncture in Russian history for the Russian Orthodox Church, where it could take a more, let's call it more open path, or the one it took, and it always took the other one. But in principle, these junctures exist, and there is always a possibility. So I'm against an idea they are doomed to fail forever. No, that is not true. And when I look at my own church, the Roman Catholic Church, if you look at the Roman Catholic Church in 1958, for example, at the death of Pope Pius XII, it was a backward organization with very little perspectives to develop. And 10 years later, we had a council, we had vernacular language in the liturgy, and it was completely a different, I mean, of course, it was not, it's a question of identity, but it changed so much of it. So changes can happen, do happen. Huh? We don't see them now. No one would have seen it for the Catholic Church in 58, but they can happen, and that's, I would be happy to give a very clear vision and a very clear path how that is going in Russia and with the Russian Orthodox Church. I cannot do that, but at least we don't have to be only pessimistic. No? There might be also a way out, which we don't see.
I would also kind of end with a more positive note that everything is possible and the hope dies last. And the positive changes in Russia and in Russian Orthodox Church could be possible, but we will see. I remember one very interesting conference years ago when I was in Georgia, actually, and we had representatives of Russian Orthodox Church there, and there was a heavy, heated debate within the Orthodox members themselves, how the church needs to proceed. At that time, it was possible still to debate. I wonder whether that kind of discussion can happen now. But at the time, the ones with very critical view of what the church was doing was saying that you are distancing yourself from your own people. But how that spins off now, that's of course the question mark. But at least it's some sort of evidence that there is some sort of hope and criticism of the activities both of the church and the Russian state within church and Russian state itself.
I would just say that I think we are really at a very dynamic juncture here, and a great many things are open to interpretation and to application. And so in that sense, I think it's worth continuing to focus on these issues and to focus on them with an especially open mind, because it is so dynamic and there are so many different factors that are influencing. It's important to be willing to imagine things quite a bit other than the way they are.
And this is all for today. We are grateful to Thomas Bremer and Catherine Wanner for joining us and sharing these incredible insights on the Russian world and a bit of hope. This is Dmytro, Vovk, and Merilin Kiviorg for FoRB Podcast, a part of Talk About Law and Religion blog on the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent the opinions of the faculty or staff of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies or J. Reuben Clark Law School, nor do they necessarily reflect the views of Brigham Young University or its sponsoring church. Tune into additional episodes at talkabout.iclrs.org or Spotify and YouTube.